Well, welcome back, Todd, for another interview.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Mike.
Well, we've been doing an interview series with Todd, why theism is a better way of trying to explain how creation happened and pointing to a creator. And so we touched on an acronym that you use, Todd. Could you want to unpack just that acronym for us?
Yeah, well, I kind of got it, talking to a youth group. The Bible says the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. And I did the old Mr. T thing. I pity the fool that thinks there is no God. So you're not a fool. You are wise. And we use every one of those letters, U.R.W.I.S.E, as an acronym. And each one of them stands for something that has its best explanation in there being a God. Mike, you use the term theism, and that's just a long way of saying people that believe that there is a God that not just created the universe and then left the building like Elvis, but a God that interacts with us, a God that interacts with us and has left us a revelation of him in some kind of a book. Theism, Christians are theists. Muslims are theists. The Jewish religion, that's a theistic religion. And so any religion that believes that God communicates with mankind and is involved in the affairs of man, that's theistic. And so these letters will, again, have their best explanation in there being a God out there that is concerned and active with what we're doing.
Well, that's great. Well, the first week we covered the letters U for universe, how it's finely tuned, and R for reason, even our ability to reason. And so I encourage people to go back and look at that. Well, today we're going into the next two letters, and one of them is W, which I believe we're looking at the sense that we all have a sense of oughtness in our life about certain behaviors that we ought to do and to be. And where do these ideas of morality actually come from? And how does that point you to a creator? I'll just give you a little quote from C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite authors. He said, whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in a real right and wrong, you'll find the same man going back on this a moment later. He may break his promise to you, but if you try breaking one to him, he'll be complaining it's not fair before you can say Jack Robinson. Do you want to unpack this as a point of deism?
Oh, he's absolutely right, Mike. That there is a universal moral law. It's not always apparent in our actions. That's evidenced by all the terrible things that human beings do to one another, including us and you and I. But it's greatly revealed in our reactions, the way we respond when we're personally untreated, what we think is unfairly. In other words, moral law is not always the standard by which we treat others, but it's nearly always the standard by which we expect others to treat us. And so there must be a universal moral law, or else all moral criticism is meaningless. For instance, you wouldn't be able to say the actions of Jeffrey Dahmer, the guy that murdered and ate 17 victims back in Milwaukee in the 1990s. You wouldn't be able to say he was wrong or that was evil if there were not an objective, universal standard that says that there are right and wrong things. Or you wouldn't be able to say, for instance, the Nazis were wrong. That was the group of Germans that thought that the best way to purge the Aryan race was to get rid of and extinguish Jews, and they did that by the millions. And so, they thought it was okay to kill the Jewish people. And that wouldn't have changed if the Germans had won the war. It would still be objectively, morally wrong. It's kind of ironic that Hermann Göring, have you heard of Hermann Göring, Mike?
Yes, I have, yeah.
Yeah, he was like the second highest Nazi official under Hitler. And of course, Hitler committed suicide, but they tried him at the Nuremberg trials. And what he said was, he says, we have done nothing wrong according to the laws of our land, the laws of our people. Now, if you're a moral relativist, you have nothing to say about that. The atrocities, the war crimes, what happened in Buchenwald and Dachau and the concentration camps, you would not be able to say that was wrong if you had no objective moral lawgiver. And, it was good that the prosecutor, Herbert Jackson, he said, there are laws that are higher than the laws of Germany and the Nazis. There was a universal law. But of course, that only has meaning if there's a universal lawgiver. And most atheists live as though there's a universal moral code. Not me nor any Christians I know have ever claimed that you have to be a believer, a Christian, to be moral, to live morally. No, what we say is you have no foundation for what is moral, what is right and wrong, what is evil and what is good, apart from a universal moral lawgiver. You know, if the atheists were able to throw off all the shackles of morality and live their lives consistently with atheism, throwing out such ideas as you know, like Dawkins said, we're just, you know, DNA propagating machines, we're, you know, living according to the dictates of our selfish genes. Well, you could say, I raped this person because, you know, it was the DNA that caused me to do it. Or life is merely a product of the survival of the fittest. And so the social Darwinism of Hitler said, we'll just do what evolution has done for centuries and continue to purge the human gene pool. First, it went after the people that had mental deficiencies and the alcoholics and those that were prone to prison. Then he went after the gypsies and the Jews and began to exterminate them. But the world shook at that. We realized that was objectively wrong. So my point is, I would be worried if the atheists could consistently live up to their creed, that there is no God, that all morality is relative. So there's an innate sense of right and wrong found in all people of all cultures. We basically have the same moral code. That murder is wrong, that rape is wrong, that child abuse is wrong, and pedophilia is wrong. We outwork some of the nuances of these differently, but universally there's a code, and I would ask, where does it come from? You know, in the book of Romans, it talks about men showing the law of God written in their hearts, their conscience bearing them witness. As a product of evolution, we shouldn't really have that kind of a moral conscience. And I think I might have brought it up recently. I said, you know, people rush into a burning building to you know, rescue a 70-year-old lady. You don't do those kinds of things if you're just acting out the selfish gene, if you're the product of the survival of the fittest. So if we were just pre-programmed DNA propagating machines without free choice, and that is the logical, inescapable conclusion of materialism. And Will Provine, you know, the late Will Provine talked all about that, and Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene talks about that. Why do we hold each other morally accountable? If I were to, again, I use the example of rape. Why would anybody hold anybody accountable to that if I were just acting out a predetermined cascade of materialistic events? It's like a bunch of dominoes hitting one another. They just, one falls and another one falls and the next one falls. If we were just a product of random chance collisions over time, we would be like one of those dominoes. We would not have we wouldn't be free moral agents. We wouldn't have free moral choice, and therefore we could not be held morally responsible. But of course, nobody believes that. I like to, when I get into discussions with atheists about this, I ask them, is it wrong to torture and kill innocent babies for fun? And if not, who said so? Like I said, Mike, to believe in moral relativism is to argue that there's no real difference between Mother Teresa's actions and Adolf Hitler's actions, no real difference between slavery and freedom, or equality versus racism, and care and abuse. It's all just someone's opinion, one opinion versus another. But we know those conclusions are absurd. So moral relativism must be false. If moral relativism is false, then there's objective moral laws do exist, and they come from an objective moral lawgiver. Therefore, the W in the U.R.W.I.S.E, the wrong and right, the morality, it's best explained and accounted for by man being created by and in the image of a God who is moral.
Some people, you know, look at cultures and say, well, some have a totally different moral codes, and you know, how is that the case? But I remember Lewis was saying that actually there are only ever small variations between cultures in terms of right and wrong. Yeah.
Right.
The second question going through the acrostic is the I, and I assume we're talking about the DNA and the incredible library of information, and just the discovery of that had many Christians excited because it was pointing more and more towards what they would say a mind behind it all, because it's not randomless. Yeah. Can you unpack that?
Yeah. And again, we're using abductive reasoning. In other words, making an inference to the best explanation. in times past and even present, some people would 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 claim and make the accusations that Christian apologists like myself that make a defense for the Bible and God and theism, we argue for the God of the gaps. In other words, we don't know this, that, or the other, therefore it must be God. Well, in this particular case specifically, this is an example of not arguing for what we don't know, but arguing from what we do know. So what we do know is every single piece of intelligent information always comes from an intelligent source. For instance, there's never been a painting without a painter, a source of intelligence, a building without an architect, a book that didn't have an author, a music composition that didn't have a composer. Even a child can easily distinguish between information and random, between a painting versus an explosion of a paint store or whatever. They can tell the difference between music on the radio stations versus the white noise, the static like that. So there's three different levels of order, if you will. There's randomness, and we all know what randomness looks like. If you take a bunch of cards and throw them up in the air, half of them will be face up, half face down, they'll be all over the place. That's random. There's simple order. Okay, a simple order would be a repeating pattern, such as if you just put, say, two letters together, T-O, 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 be 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. A snowflake would be an example, or an ice crystal, or mineral crystals are examples of simple repeating orders. Sand dunes, you see nice ripples and sand dunes and waves in the ocean. That is called simple order. It's not random, but it's simple order. The third type of order is called information or specified complexity. I use the example with youth groups is that if you took building alphabet blocks and dropped them in front of Junior, you know, he's like 8 months old, they'd scatter all over the place. That would be random. If you came back and he put them all in a line, but not spelling anything out, that would be order, because the order would be a line. But if Mom came around the corner and it spelled out, "I love you, Mommy," Mommy would know that there was intelligence behind. Either they have a little savant on their hand, a little genius, because information comes from an intelligent source, or Daddy's hiding someplace. And just those letters, there's 13 letters, "I love you, Mommy," there's one chance in 100 trillion. In other words, if you took all the necessary letters and dropped them, it would take you 100 trillion times to get that right. One chance in 100 trillion times. Now, you kind of touched on it, that life, it has an order of magnitude. The information in our DNA has an order of magnitude beyond that. That's just one 13-letter sentence. Our DNA, human DNA, for instance, it's like 32 gigs of information. If all the information in our human DNA was spelled out in a book, it would be, I've got it written down. It's like, it would take you 37 years to read it. It would be 5 million pages worth. And it's an incredible amount of information there. Bill Gates, who knows a little bit about information theory, he said DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any software ever written. And he knows that behind every computer program, there's a computer programmer. And so the obvious question is, where did this information come from? It's kind of like questions that don't go away until they get an adequate answer. It's like the old Santa Claus things. As kids grow up, they begin to ask, you know, what about people who don't have chimneys, Mom? What about people who have a dog, an angry dog? And how does Santa Claus get from every house? You know, there's only so much time in a day. Questions that don't get adequately answered keep coming back. This is one of those questions that has no good answer at all. And again, it's arguing for what we do know. We do know that information only comes from an intelligent source. And so my postulate is that by using the tools of logic and reason and abductive reasoning, I would postulate that a belief in God as an intelligent being is the best answer to that question, the most logical answer to that question.
So how do atheists sort of work out the DNA, you know, like you're saying, that all of this information could be just contained in a cell and it's just randomly put there? I mean,
yeah.
What are their explanations for this?
Yeah, well, You probably won't believe it. I've heard of three main ones being postulated by the greatest minds out there. One is that it did organize itself by chance. Now remember, our DNA, we've got 3 billion base pairs, we've got 32 gigs of information, we've got 5 million pages worth of information. I Love You Mummy has got 1 in 100 million chances of organizing itself by itself randomly. Our DNA, or the DNA of the simplest living organism, that's kind of a misnomer right there. There's no such thing as a simple, even bacteria. But they say, well, given enough time, all things are possible. Well, there's two problems with that. One, we don't have an infinite amount of time. The universe is only possibly 13.8 billion years old. The Earth and biological things, where things could evolve, is only about, let's give it 4 billion years old. That's not near enough time to allow for the random arrangements of the DNA to make an intelligent sentence like that. It would be like if I gave you one of those cheap bike locks with the 4 combinations. Could you solve this, Mike? Yeah. I could do that. Give me a couple hours. No. Could you solve it in 30 seconds without getting extremely lucky? And again, you have to do that over and over again because there's lots of different DNA out there. So the first postulate is, well, it just organizes itself over time. Given enough time, all things are possible. The second postulate, a guy named Dr. Michael U.R.W.I.S.E, he's a philosopher of biology, says, well, crystals helped organize the DNA. And if you see an electron micrograph of a clay crystal, it spins around like that, kind of like a double helix. But there's a real problem. If those molecules adhered to the clay, you would get order. It would be like the building blocks being in a line, but it wouldn't tell you where the information, where the code came from. Speaking of code, that leads us to our third one. The guys that broke the genetic code, James Watson and Francis Crick, back in 1953, they won a Nobel Prize for doing so. And Crick realized, he was a code breaker in World War II, so he knew about information and coded information. He looked at this and he said, this is nothing other than a digital encodedness. And he realized that codes comes from an intelligent source. And so Francis Crick, a lot of people don't know this, looked up into the sky and said, it must have come from, I'm not going to say God, it must have come from aliens. I kid you not. He said it must have come from alien life. This is not something he said while drunk in a bar one day. He wrote a book about it with Leslie Orgel in 1973 and has defended the position 3 times. It's called directed panspermia. So that's not really an answer. It takes the question and puts it somewhere else in another time and place in the universe, potentially. We haven't discovered any life or hints of it. But it also admits that it took intelligence to do so. It wasn't just human intelligence somewhere. Some alien intelligence did it. And so, G.K. Chesterton, the late Chesterton, he said, when a man stops believing in God, he doesn't stop believing, when a man stops believing in God, he doesn't then believe in nothing. He believes anything. And I find that to be true. When people stop grasping or believing kind of the most, the inference to the best explanation, God, an intelligent source, they'll believe aliens or blind chance or clay crystals or combinations of those. So I think theism, an intelligent God, is the best explanation for an intelligent information in our genetic code.
That's fantastic. Thanks very much for going through these next 2 letters. And next week, we'll be looking at the final 2 letters. But beyond that, I'd love us to enter into a little discussion as to how God has made himself known to us. Because unless he does it, we'll never get to know him. So,
yeah.
So thanks very much.
It's not enough just to say there's a God out there. People want to know which God.
Yeah.
How do you know this God, that God, or the other? So we're coming for you. Keep tuning in, people.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, God bless, and thanks very much for the time.
All right, Mike. Bless you now. Bye.
Bye.